It is Big Talk with Todd and Noah. He is Todd Blackledge. I am Noah Eagle. We are presented by Xfinity 10G Network. All right, Todd, we got to College Park. It's been a while since you had been there in that DMV area. A lot of DMV ties in the game. But how was your experience back there in Maryland and getting a feel for the campus?
I enjoyed it, other than the weather, on game day. That was the only thing I felt like kind of put a damper on it. I enjoyed my time on campus, and you've done a game there. I'd never broadcast a game there. I played there way back in 1980 or 81, but I never called a game from there. So it was cool to be on campus. Actually went and spoke to some broadcast journalism students on Friday, and the weather was great, until game day. And I just think that the rain and the lightning and all that, put a little bit of a damper on it, but it was still a fun game to call.
Yeah, it was a bummer because I do think fans were excited about a primetime game slot and having Biff Poggi back and getting that DMV feel from both sides would have been massive. But even so, the students showed up. That student section was full, which was nice to see. And you mentioned it. You talked to those broadcast kids. They're impressive at Maryland. I'm going to give them their props. That's Philip Merrill School. They know what they're doing. Yeah,
the thing that stood out to me, I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but there are about 25 students in there, and the guy that was orchestrating it, he had me give a little introduction, about my background, and they said, okay, before we get into anything else, I want to go around the room and have each one of you introduce yourself and kind of say what you're doing, what you're involved in. And every single one, even the kids who were freshmen that had just been on campus for a couple months, were already involved in something, some form of either writing for the school paper or covering this sport or doing that. And then when I got to the game on Saturday, I ran into 3 or 4 of the kids that were in that little meeting that were doing something, some form or fashion at the game. So that was very impressive to me, just how, involved and integrated they are already in the media.
Cool to see it. Cool to feel that energy. And I'm sure we'll get a lot of that this coming week when we got the Syracuse WAER kids making their way over to West Lafayette. So we'll have plenty of the feel. I'll be ready to represent hard. So I hope you're
the Harvard of Central New York, right? That's what my old partner used to refer to it as all the time.
Yeah, well, I used to call it the Harvard of the Northeast, and then I realized Harvard's in the Northeast, and so it doesn't really prove that much of a point. So we'll go with Central New York. I think
there you go.
Week two had some fun games, some wild stuff. Let's just start your overarching kind of thoughts and reactions from what we saw last week in college football.
Yeah. So, first of all, my first reaction is, the whole incredible thing that's happening with the Colorado Buffaloes continued, right? They continue to impress. I think the thing that was interesting to me about this game is, it was a home opener. It was a sellout. Ralphie was running, everything, all things were coming together. And yet the game was not easy for Colorado. Nebraska, even though they didn't score in the first half, they created a lot of pressure on Shedeur Sanders, and they, had some confusion, and they were playing tough. And, but Colorado just kind of, waited for their turn. And when they finally hit their stride, they ended up taking control of the game and winning going away. And so it was a different win than in week one. It took a little more effort and they had to work through some things, but it was still very impressive. And of course, Shedeur Sanders now, we talk about Caleb Williams, we talk about Drake May, all these quarterbacks, Bo Nix. Here's another Pac-12 quarterback that is really off to a great start. 393 yards, 2 more touchdowns. I think that gives him 7 touchdown passes in the first 2 weeks. So the Colorado story was number one. Second thing that stood out to me, obviously Texas, and for years, I can remember doing a game with Joe Tessitore. It was an opening game in Austin against Notre Dame, and Texas won the game. And Joe Tess, said those dreadful words of, Texas is back, and I think people have been wanting to say that for so long, and then they kind of disappoint, at some point. This is a pretty solid Texas team. I think that Sark has his best team. They were impressive both offensively and defensively in the win against Alabama. And, beating Nick Saban's team by double digits in Tuscaloosa does not happen. That was impressive. I thought Texas could have won the game and maybe would have won the game last year if Quinn Ewers doesn't get hurt. He stays healthy in this one, 349 yards and 3 touchdowns. Their defense also did a good job getting 2 interceptions and 5 sacks. So that was very impressive by Texas. Third thing that stood out to me, Noah, is it's been a long time since we have said it, in the same week, even though Florida State didn't play this past week, but the idea that Florida State and Miami both looked impressive. I mean, there was a point in time, many years ago, they were always, in the topic of the conversation as the best teams in college football. And we haven't said that, talked about them very glowingly, particularly in the same week. And, Florida State looked great in their win over LSU in week 1. Miami with an impressive win over Texas A&M, 48-33. Tyler Van Dyke healthy. Their quarterback had a big game with 5 touchdown passes. So, it'll be interesting to see if those two teams keep it up, here as we get beyond week 2. And then the last thing, the Pac-2, as it's come to be now, is 4-0. And, the Pac-12, we got one more year of it, but they're off as a conference off to a great start. They're 6-3 against Power 5 opponents, but Oregon State and Washington State are both undefeated. DJ Uiagalelei is kind of found a home out there in Corvallis and is leading a very good football team with Oregon State. And Washington State, maybe one of the best wins of the weekend, beating Wisconsin, who was ranked number 19. That's a hard place to get to. It's a hard place to go travel and play a game. And then on top of that, you're typically playing a pretty good football team. And, Washington State, that game, Wisconsin came back in it in the fourth quarter. At one point, I think it was 24-22. They cut the lead. And then Washington State scored again and was able to win the football game. And more impressively, they held Wisconsin to 90 yards rushing, which, the Badgers had over 340 yards rushing in week 1. So anyway, those are the 4 things that really kind of grabbed my attention in week 1.
Yeah, a couple of those games we're really going to hit on as the show goes on here. But just to circle back real quickly on Alabama, Texas, obviously that was going on during our game, so we didn't get to watch it live. But going back and just rewatching the highlights, there's one thing that stood out because you brought it up. Last year, I remember watching that game front to back, and Quinn Ewers goes down. You say, man, they had all the momentum in their favor. They built themselves the lead. And Hudson Card comes in. He plays well. And by the way, he filled in for Quinn very nicely the next couple of weeks until he was ready to return. It was a Bryce Young masterclass down the stretch in that one. He made some heroic plays, and that was necessary to squeak by and keep Alabama unbeaten to start the year in week 2 there. My question was going to be for Texas, how would they handle the emotion of a full year of hearing you should have won that game or feeling you should have won that game, now going to Tuscaloosa, having your quarterback back, and after they took the early lead, they go down in this game, for them to fight back, for them to deal with those emotions. That to me was the most impressive thing out of the win for Texas.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think they showed a lot of character, a lot of heart. Again, going into Tuscaloosa, that is not an easy place to play. And I mean, I know they're used to hot weather in Texas, but the heat and humidity in Alabama is no joke. And they just hung in there. And I think, Quinn Ewers he's a special player. He has special arm talent. And I also just like his confidence and his swagger, willingness to throw the ball downfield and attack. I saw that last year, and of course he showed it again. And they've recruited well. They've got good skill. They seem to be stronger in the trenches. So we'll see if Texas can sustain this now. That's a huge win. And now in their last year of playing in the Big 12, the only team that's made it to the college football playoff out of the state of Texas since it's been in is TCU last year. So Texas, we'll see what they can do now.
I'm still a little upset about Quinn Ewers for cutting the mullet, but I'm going to get over it eventually. If he plays well without it, he plays well without it. So it's all good. Notre Dame, one more game that we should hit outside the Big Ten. Notre Dame, we have them next week where we're paying attention to what Sam Hartman and company are doing over there, and they end up getting a big win over NC State. They go on the road. There's incredible delays in that game, and so the composure of coming back through the weather, dealing with some early game adversity where the offense finally looked mortal in that first quarter, and they just took it to them in the fourth quarter. They outscored them 21-7. They outscore NC State in the fourth quarter. They win the game 45-24. And again, it felt like more than anything, Notre Dame really relied on the presence of Sam Hartman in the game.
I mean, he's an old head, I mean, he's not only an older guy just chronologically, but he's played so much football, right? I mean, he's seen everything. He's been there. And so, yeah, you're right. He's a very calming presence and also a very talented player. And I just think overall we're seeing a more mature Notre Dame team, in the way that they're playing here early in the season. Remember last year, they looked really good out of the gate against Ohio State in a loss, and then didn't look so good, the next few weeks, and then finally put it together at the end. So for them to start on a more consistent basis this year, I think has been very impressive, and credit to Marcus Freeman and his staff. But also, again, Sam Hartman makes a big difference just for the whole team, not just the offensive guys in the huddle, but the defensive guys. Everybody on the sideline is looking to him, taking his cues in terms of how they handle things, whether it's a delay because of weather, whether it's falling behind, whether it's a close game on the road, and he's kind of setting the tone for him.
Yeah, there was a cool video just to exemplify what you said, that Sam Hartman's an old head who's got experience and kind of knows how to act and how to be that leader in quarterback one. He, after the game, would go over to the Notre Dame fans on the road and pump them up, as most quarterbacks will do, or most stars of the game will go over after they're interviewed. And he waited until the NC State alma mater was finished. He waited until, the rest of the players and fans that were remaining there were done singing along the alma mater. And then right as they finished up, he went over to the fans, pumped them up. I thought that was pretty cool. Yeah. And it's just an example of the type of person he is, the type of leader that he is. And I think he's changed the trajectory, certainly, of the team. But that was a good test, at least week 3 for them. Yeah. And to feel like, or week 2, I guess, third game of the season for them, but to handle it the way they did was great. So it was nice to see, and obviously for us was great that they get up to 9 in the AP poll and see if they can even extend that further before we go to that tilt over in South Bend with Ohio State. Last couple games, just to kind of hit on scores. You mentioned Miami with a big win over Texas A&M, massive for the ACC. A great start for that conference as well to the season, with Duke rising in the rankings, right. Miami and Florida State playing the way they have, UNC still playing well. So that's been nice to see. We've got Syracuse this week, who have outscored their opponents 1-0-0, it feels like, through the first 2 games. So solid start to the season for the ACC. Utah barely escapes Baylor in one of the more controversial down the stretch moments of the week 2 slate, where Utah gets away in theory with a pass interference call that isn't called after they scored at what looked like was the clear game-winning score, and then somehow Baylor gets all the way back in position to try to tie it. That was a crazy game. UNC and App State was once again a crazy game. And I mean, I know we talked about this on Saturday, but Mac Brown after the game literally said, I think we're done scheduling Appalachian. I think it's over. And I don't disagree with him after the last 2 years.
Yeah, no, that's and again, games like that for a team like App State, they have nothing to lose, right? I mean, nobody expects them to win, but they've knocked teams off in the past. They're not afraid to play anybody, and but they come in loose. North Carolina is coming off of a big win in Charlotte in week 1 over South Carolina. They had a little bit of a distraction, with the Tez Walker situation in the NCAA. And so maybe they just weren't as locked in as they needed to be. But again, we talked about a guy like Sam Hartman. We talked about a guy like Caleb Williams. We talked about, Shedeur Sanders. Drake May is he's in that conversation too. And he was not going to let them lose and found a way to get him in the end zone at the end to win in overtime. But yeah, it's been an exciting start for the ACC, that's for sure.
Big time. And the other quarterback name you mentioned earlier, Bo Nix, Oregon escapes with a crazy, crazy win over Texas Tech. Tech's trying to make up for what happened to them in week 1, and it looked like they were going to do exactly that. They came out, they go up 27-18 entering the fourth quarter, and the way Oregon came back and eventually won that game, a pick 6, they go up 31-30. With a field goal with just over a minute remaining. But composure for Dan Lanning's team. And again, for the Pac-12, I know we're going to hit on that Colorado-Nebraska game in deeper detail in a little bit. But considering what's happened so far this year for the Pac-12 teams, USC has looked like world beaters. They haven't played anybody yet that has really challenged them, but they've looked outstanding, and that offense has looked better than ever. You mentioned, or we mentioned, at least Utah gets another close win, but they get another win, and that's a team that was in the Rose Bowl last year. Oregon has looked strong. Washington has looked strong. Yeah. And you go down the list, Oregon State might be one of the most underrated teams in the country with the way they can play defense and with what DJ Uiagalelei is bringing to them as a little bit more of a dynamic run-pass option guy. They just have a lot of teams, a lot of depth, and it's ironic that it's in the last year of the conference and they're all together. But it seems like one of the most strong conferences in the entire country right now with the way they've played through a couple weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're pretty strong top to bottom. And then there's no question, there's no conference that compares to them in terms of quarterback talent. I mean, they've got the best. I mean, they've got 6-7 guys that are playing at a very high level. And you mentioned Bo Nix, and I just find it. I mean, I like Bo Nix. I covered a lot of his games at Auburn, and his dad played at Auburn. He came in a highly recruited guy. He played really well as a freshman, showed flashes of brilliance, and then never quite reached the level I think that Auburn fans or people expected him to. But it was such a weight and a burden he was carrying also in that role. And he loved Auburn, but I mean, just to see him thrive out in Eugene now I'm so happy for him. The kid got married. His life is different. He's playing the best football of his life. He probably could have left last year and gone somewhere in the NFL, wanted to stay and play another year. I think he's enjoying life that much. And now it's only been 2 games, but seeing DJ Uiagalelei, almost a similar situation, highly recruited. He was going to be the next great thing. We saw flashes when he had to fill in for Trevor Lawrence when Trevor was injured. He played against Notre Dame and threw for like 400 yards, but it never really happened for him when he became the starter. And it wasn't just all him. He didn't have the same tools around him in his first year as a starter that Trevor Lawrence did, and took a lot of heat, a lot of criticism. And so now to see him with kind of a new lease on life way out on the Pacific Northwest, I just think it's great.
It is. It's been reclamation projects is maybe the wrong word, but to see them reclaim their own careers in the way that they have has been fantastic. So,
and I guess you could say the same thing for Michael Penix Jr. 100%. I mean, he was good at Indiana, but he had injury problems and whatever, and goes out there, and now, I mean, he's the real deal.
Yeah, and that's the other thing, and just that it reminded me of something else in the Pac-12. The coaches there right now are all very good. Yeah. Very good. Kalen DeBoer is an outstanding football coach. Jake Dickert is continuing to prove himself at Washington State as being legit. Dan Lanning, I think if you talked to him when he was at Georgia as the defensive coordinator, you knew he was going to be a successful head coach. Right. Obviously, Lincoln Riley, Chip Kelly, and the list goes on and on and on. They have some outstanding coaches that are all going to disperse, obviously, after this year, and not to mention Coach Prime and what he's done at Colorado.
Let's go. You mentioned also, I mean, we talked about Utah. There was controversy there, but the other thing to keep in mind, Utah is 2-0 after beating Florida in week 1 and then Baylor on the road in week 2 without their starting quarterback. Yep. Cam Rising hasn't played yet, and he's one of those elite level Pac-12 quarterbacks who's still coming back from injury. So the fact that Kyle Whittingham's team has won their first 2 games using a combination of 2 backup quarterbacks, pretty impressive as well.
Now, Kyle's another elite coach as well. I should have mentioned him in that group. They just have, to me, some really undervalued guys who have stepped up as head coaches and proven themselves once again this year, which has been awesome to see. As we transition to the Big Ten, obviously 4 of those teams will join the conference next year, which is exciting, and all 4 with outstanding coaches, which is even more exciting. Maryland and Charlotte's the game that we had this week. Real quick, let's hit on it. Charlotte jumps out to the 14-0 lead, and we're looking at each other saying, what's going on right now? Now, Biff Poggi, we talked about it during the game, injected confidence, injected energy into his kids, that DMV connection. Most of them who either played at St. Francis or transferred in from Michigan or transferred in from Maryland or a Power 5 school, they weren't afraid. They weren't concerned. They just went out there and they played with their hair on fire. And that first offensive possession was amazing. That pick 6 right off the bat was incredible. But Credit Maryland, something we hit on pretty extensively down the stretch. Credit them for the way that they just kept their composure. Talia Tungavailoa didn't get too high, didn't get too low,
Right.
threw a couple interceptions, bounced right back. But your overall thoughts as we saw Maryland end up cruising to a 38-20 win?
Yeah, so a couple things. First of all, from the Maryland perspective, and if Maryland fans are having questions, after week 2, I would say this first and foremost. Charlotte is a much better football team than anybody realized. And I think, anybody that watched our game got to see that. I mean, that's a legitimate Power 5 level defense that they have. And so for 3 quarters, they played Maryland even, and then ultimately just got, I think they ran out of gas. They didn't have the depth, they didn't have the strength, but they're a good football team, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. I think the other thing, and you hit on it, Talia didn't have his best game. Both of his interceptions, one, he got fooled by the coverage. The other, he didn't put the ball in the right place. But the coaches talked to us, and he talked to us about being able to get back to neutral, no matter what's happening, get to that place of neutral. And he did that. He kept his composure. He didn't panic. Locks didn't panic. The team didn't panic when they were down 14-0. And they kind of just grinded it out until they took control of the game in the fourth quarter. And I was very impressed with Roman Hemby. We knew he was going to get the ball more and be a bigger part of their offense. And they really leaned on him and their running game down the stretch. And I think it was a good win. I think it was a really good win because it wasn't easy and it wasn't pretty, particularly in the first half. But they found a way to win, and they end up winning, pretty comfortably in the fourth quarter. So, it was a good step. I was impressed with Maryland's defense, too. I think that their defense is solid. And the biggest question still going forward, if you talk about Maryland trying to take that next step to beat an Ohio State, to beat a Michigan, to beat a Penn State, the offensive line, how good can they be? How much more can they gel? They've had some guys injured, so their depth is a question there, too. So that, to me, is the big key. I think everywhere else that I look at that team, they match up pretty well.
No doubt. Real quick, again, just giving flowers to Charlotte. They were picked last in the AAC this year.
Yeah.
Biff was adamant at Media Day that was a mistake. And when you talk to him, you can tell how much he loves these kids and how much those kids love him. And you could feel that on the field as well. But that it didn't look like a team that's going to finish last in the American. No. I think we can say that pretty confidently.
Yeah, and the other thing that was impressive to me, because I think both of us anticipated with so many players from that area and 6 players on the team that transferred from Maryland, that the emotions would maybe get the best of them. We might see some silly penalties or whatever. None of that. I mean, they played with great composure. They just didn't have quite enough. So the key for them is going to be staying healthy here over the next few weeks. They've got Georgia State at home, and then they have to go down to Gainesville to play Florida before they get into their conference schedule. So, they were down a couple defensive linemen when we saw them on Saturday night. And so, staying healthy is going to be really important because their first 11 guys on both sides of the ball are pretty good.
Absolutely. Maryland's next game, they've got Virginia at home on Friday. Mm-hmm. So you hit on Colorado off the top, and let's look at this from Nebraska's side of things. Final score is 36-14. I agree with you. I thought Nebraska's defense was incredibly impressive, especially in that first half. They were getting the Shedeur Sanders basically certainly every big third down.
Yeah.
Shedeur had very little time in the pocket. He was constantly on the run. And look, he's superhuman in many ways where he can make plays and extend plays and do things that a lot of guys really don't have the ability to do. But a lot of credit to Nebraska's defense. The big storyline that I think everybody's going to continue to talk about here is Jeff Sims.
Right.
And he has another rough day in terms of turning the ball over, a couple of fumbles, a couple of interceptions. The most recent report, at least, is that Matt Rule is going to stick with Sims at quarterback. And it's what we had chatted about after the game on Saturday when we were watching it. It's what I think a lot of people are looking at with Matt Rule in year one. And we talked about it in our first episode of this show. Matt Rule's biggest trait as a coach is instilling a culture and taking that culture to the next level. Part of that is he went out and got this guy at quarterback, and he wants to make sure he's pumping confidence into the kid. The other side of it is making sure that the team's confidence overall doesn't waver.
It's a tough situation for Matt Rule because he did go out and get this guy. Kind of handpicked Jeff Sims to be his quarterback. They had a quarterback who had started the year before, wasn't available in spring because of injury. And then as soon as they saw Jeff Sims was going to be the guy, he jumped in the portal and took off. And that's one of the problems with the portal is having depth at the quarterback position. You know, there's usually a big disparity. You don't normally have two guys that you feel great about playing. So Sims is their guy. Turnovers had been a problem for him in his past, you know, when he was with Georgia Tech. Super talented. You can see it on the long touchdown run and a couple throws he makes. He's got ability. But 2 weeks in a row, Nebraska's chance of winning, both on the road at Minnesota and then on the road at Colorado, were taken away by turnovers. And you know, costly turnovers. And it wasn't all Jeff Sims. In the Minnesota game, one of the running backs had a key fumble, you know, late in the game. But Jeff Sims has had his share and really took away their chance and took away how great their defense played. And I think at a certain point that just kind of breaks your will, you know, it kind of breaks your spirit. And so the big question now is, you know, Matt Rule, you know, I know he wants to show loyalty to Jeff Sims. And I know if he made a change or makes a change, he might lose the kid. You know, the kid might go in the tank, right? And because the guy behind him is not a very experienced guy, a very talented athlete, but not a super experienced guy. So, you know, the fine line is, do I try to keep this guy pumped up and let him know that we're confident in him and the team still believes him? Or am I going to lose the locker room? Is my team going to say, hey, wait a minute, coach, we need to make a change. You know, we can't keep doing this. So I do think I understand why he would go with him again this week. However, I do not think he'll have as long of a leash in this game if things start to go the way they've gone the first 2 weeks with turnovers.
So their next game, they host Northern Illinois on Saturday. And it's unfair to just look at the overall record and say, man, 0-2, same old Nebraska, because it feels like they've given themselves chances to really win these games. And I'm not to say that they hadn't done that the last couple of years with Scott Frost and all those one-score losses, but it just felt a little different. Certainly that first game against Minnesota and even last week against the red-hot Colorado, to play defensively the way they did, it felt a little different already. So I do kind of feel those steps forward.
Right.
And if they're going to get a win, this week has to be it. They cannot drop the game to Northern Illinois. And if Jeff Sims is going to keep the job, to your point, he's got to play well this week. It just has to happen. Yeah,
and it'd be really big. I mean, big for everybody, and Matt Rule included. And so I would anticipate, again, I have a lot of faith in him as a coach, his ability to keep a team together. And so I think we'll see a good product on the field on Saturday from Nebraska.
Yeah, Colorado hosts Colorado State on Saturday, another game I'm sure that will get plenty of attention and another chance for Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter and everybody to showcase their overall skill. Let's move over to Purdue and Virginia Tech. Purdue comes off a really tough loss week one, Fresno State, and you're wondering, Ryan Walters, first time head coach, at least with this program, and you're looking at this and saying, okay, how's he going to handle this? How's he going to keep this team together? You go to Virginia Tech, and we know the Hokies aren't what they maybe were 15 years ago, but it's still going to one of the most difficult environments in college football. Blacksburg is not an easy place to play. You know those fans are always going to show up. And with a 5-hour and 27-minute weather delay, Purdue keeps enough concentration. Hudson Card rushes for what would be the game-winning touchdown with 8 minutes left in the game. They win it 24-17 and get their first victory under Ryan Walters. Impressive composure, especially considering the weather issue, but it felt like a necessary win for Purdue, considering they've got a Syracuse team this week that's really confident right now through 2 weeks.
Yeah, I think it's a great win for Purdue. And, you know, think about this. I mean, I was sitting there thinking, you know, I've never sat through a 5.5 hour or 6 hour weather delay. I've sat through a few delays, you know, but nothing like that. And, you know, if you had to endure that, doing it at home in your home locker room would be way better than having to do it in a visiting team locker room, you know, because most visiting team locker rooms, even at the nicest stadiums, are not nearly as nice as the home team, right? So,
and some of them are pink. I don't know.
Yeah, right. I know. So credit them for just keeping their self together and staying relaxed and coming back out and finding a way to win. You know, now the The only positive, I think, for Purdue having to sit through that delay is the crowd wasn't the same when they came back out, because that's a raucous place and a difficult place to play as that game started. But, by the time they finished it, there weren't very many people there. And they came away with a much needed win and some confidence now to come home. And we're expecting a sellout crowd, great night game atmosphere against a pretty good Syracuse team.
So we'll preview that game in detail in a little bit. Virginia Tech goes to Rutgers this coming week, and we'll look to bounce back after a tough loss for them. They felt like they had chances to win that game, no doubt. Iowa State, last kind of in-depth look in the Big Ten, the CyHawk battle. And again, we're looking at total points for Iowa here. They go 24 in week 1 and 20 in week 2. So that means that if you were to pace it out, for each week, 25 a week, you're supposed to be at 50 and they're at 44. So just a little bit short, but they're 2-0. And again, that defense really rules, as it always does at Iowa.
And I'm also wondering if that point total, the 20, if they get full credit for the 20, because I think they had a pick 6 in that game too, was one of their touchdowns. So, but that was a typical Iowa game. And Iowa and Iowa State always play hard-nosed games. And for whatever reason, Iowa really seems to have the upper hand in that series, even when Iowa State has had maybe a better-looking team on paper. But and I think that was a big, 200th win for Kirk Ferentz also. Yep. So a big win for him, a milestone win in his career in their rivalry game. And Iowa's right where they want to be. They're undefeated. And, we've seen glimpses of their offense with Cade McNamara looking better. But they haven't really blown anybody out yet in terms of scoring a lot of points, but they're where they want to be.
Well, I think that's exactly it. And it's a process for them. And I think let's see them build it over the course of the year. We know what that defense is going to be. They're always going to be in games regardless. And so if Cade McNamara can make enough plays, that's really all they need. I understand that the 25 points per game is the benchmark, and that's a Brian Ferentz specific thing. But for an overarching team thing, they just need someone who can be dynamic enough when they need him to be dynamic enough. And we know Cade McNamara has that in his bag. So excited to see as they continue this season what they look like. Penn State beat Delaware 63-7. Ohio State over Youngstown State and Kyle McCord looked a little bit better in game number 2, 35-7. Michigan over UNLV 35-7. And you mentioned the big one, Washington State beats Wisconsin 31-22. Let's just quickly hit on that game. First of all, I think Cam Ward's a very dynamic quarterback for Washington State, someone who can really he's polarizing. He's unpredictable because he can make big plays, but he can also hurt your own offense and throw some bad interceptions. Right. He made some big plays in this game, just plain and simple. And that was a big reason that Washington State found a way to win it. The other part for Wisconsin, similarly, year 1 with this head coach, Luke Fickell's there. We know Luke Fickell can coach. We know what his track record looks like. But it's still year 1 with a new coach. And I think to just assume that they were going to hit the ground running and be this fantastic team right off the bat, I'm not sure. Look, we know they're talented, but I'm not sure that you can just say, hey, they're going to be great from day one. Allow him to build it, and let's see what they look like by midway through this season. Let's see that midway point and the second half of the season. I think they have a chance to be really good, but it's so early. And the best part about this, even though it was a loss, it was a non-conference loss. So Absolutely. It's not going to hurt you in that Big Ten West.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing. Okay. I mean, it was a loss. You learn from it, you grow from it. Sometimes you can coach and teach better after a loss, because you got kids' attention, especially if they think they should have been, in a position to win. So you grow from that. And you mentioned new coach, a lot of new players. They were as active in the transfer portal as anybody in the Big Ten.
Yep.
And then you got new coordinators, a completely different system on offense with Phil Longo. The defense is a new coordinator. It's not as big of an overhaul as it was on the offensive side, but there's still growing pains for that, and again, we mentioned this early. Washington State is not an easy place to play. They've had their share of upsets on ranked teams up there on the Palouse before. So credit them, credit Washington State for being ready to play and beat a ranked opponent, and Wisconsin will grow from it, I'm sure.
Yeah, late comeback bid from Wisconsin as well. So it was nice to see that at least they continued to fight through the rest of that game. It was 24-9 at halftime, and Cam Ward, the big numbers with over 200 yards passing and 2 touchdowns. Indiana, Minnesota, Michigan State, Rutgers, Northwestern all get victories. So good for Northwestern to get back in the win column.
Yeah.
And Illinois, we saw on Friday, fall to a good Kansas team. And Lance Leipold continues to do great work over there in Lawrence and deserves his flowers. 35-24, the final score of that one. But Illinois, who narrowly escaped week 1 with a win, now searching for answers in the post Ryan Walters defense era themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's going to be interesting now coming into this week and those teams that got the win. I mean, how about Rutgers being undefeated, 2-0? I mean, that's good for them. Good for Catherine, our sideline reporter, who's a proud Rutgers alum. So her team is undefeated. Your team is undefeated. My team is undefeated. So
yeah, we sweep it through.
3 for 3. That's right.
Yeah, we're good. Yeah, I mean, listen, we can try to just keep the vibes as high as possible through the rest of the year. That's all we can ask for.
Yeah.
Let's go week 3 previews here. We'll start with Minnesota UNC because Minnesota has gotten 2 impressive wins. Certainly that week 1 victory to just stay in that game with Nebraska. It looked like they had it lost on so many occasions, and PJ Fleck's group just finds a way. We talked about North Carolina and how good Drake May has looked, how good that team is capable of being. They had to squeak past App State,
Right.
but they did it, and they got the win, and that's all that matters. They had the more impressive victory week 1 against South Carolina. So when you look at this matchup, what really stands out to you?
Yeah, Minnesota, they kind of fascinate me. I mean, PJ has done such a great job there. And, they've been a very high-level winning team for the last couple of years under him. And I don't know if they're as good this year talent-wise as they've been in the last couple of years. They don't make the critical errors. They take care of the football. They're good on third down. They're good in the red zone. All those areas that help you win a game. Minnesota does a great job with that. I think they're the fewest penalized team in the Big Ten last year. So they're very well coached. They're disciplined and they don't beat themselves. And, going into play North Carolina, Drake May is an incredibly talented guy. They had their running back ran for 234 yards, I think, in the last game. So that they're good on offense. So if you're Minnesota, your main thing is, let's be able to run the ball, possess the ball on the road, and limit their opportunities offensively, and then just play sound, mistake-free football like we're accustomed to doing and try to get the game into the fourth quarter and see if we can win.
Yeah, this has a chance to be a really sneaky, fun game. So that one in Chapel Hill, Minnesota with a chance to get a fairly big statement victory in just week 3 of this 2023 season. Illinois-Penn State, you mentioned that this is going to be fascinating to watch from an Illinois perspective for sure, but even for a Penn State perspective as well, because we've seen Drew Aller now through these 2 games. He looked awesome week 1 against West Virginia. They play an FCS opponent week 2, and he helps carve them up. He doesn't even really have to play in the second half of that game. So this Drew Aller era is clearly – it's well past the Sean Clifford era, as crazy as that sounds, for as long as he was the starter there. And they're into this Drew Aller, Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, Keandre Lambert-Smith offense with that menacing Manny Diaz defense. You go up against the Illinois team now coming off a loss that's going to want to find themselves back on the right track. And Brett Bielema always has some tricks up his sleeve. So I'm not just going to count out the Illini just because they looked poor maybe in week 1 or 2. He's going to get his guys ready for this. He always does. So what do you see with these 2 teams as Penn State looks to go 3-0?
Well, I think that, Illinois definitely has got to be looking for a bounce back opportunity. That was a disappointing loss to Kansas. The biggest thing that's been surprising to me in the first 2 weeks of the season from the Illinois standpoint is I know they lost some guys in the draft on defense, and I know they lost Ryan Walters to go be the head coach at Purdue, but I thought that they still had enough to be a really stingy, strong defense, and they have not played all that well defensively in the first 2 games. Now, last week, Jalen Daniels with Kansas is a dynamic dual threat guy. Drew Aller's not the same kind of quarterback, but extremely talented. And I don't think Kansas had the kind of running backs that they'll see with Penn State. So it'll be a real challenge for the Illinois defense, but I would expect them to try to step up and play better than they played. And then offensively, kind of what I was talking about with Minnesota, if you can possess the ball and run the football, hit some play action passes, shorten the game a little bit, and limit the number of times Penn State gets it on offense, and limit their opportunities for explosive plays, and you have a chance to kind of fight your way into the game and try to get into the fourth quarter. So I would expect to see the best version of Illinois football that we've seen so far this year. I don't know if that's good enough to beat Penn State or not, because I think through 2 weeks, Penn State has looked as good and as impressive on both sides of the ball as anybody in college football, right? Not just the Big Ten, anybody in college football.
Well, certainly the Big Ten, but I think you're absolutely correct. It's been wildly impressive, and we could feel the confidence that the group had overall. Definitely James Franklin, the way that just his vibe and being around the team, you could tell that he knew this team had a chance to be special. And so far, I think they've passed each test with flying colors. And Drew Aller just looks so at ease with taking over this job and taking over that role as a leader. And that was one of the things that we had heard, by the way, was that all their vocal and distinct leaders they had last year were all gone, whether it was Sean Clifford or whether those defensive studs that they lost were really vocal for them. It's been more of a leadership by committee to a certain degree for Penn State, and guys who maybe are a little more subdued in their vocal ways have been willing to speak up a bit more. But it's been cool to see just them come together so quickly and play the way they have. So it'll be nice as another test for them against Illinois this week.
Yeah, and I think, getting back to, what James Franklin and his staff did with Drew Aller last year, this will be their first road game now going to Champaign. And Drew Aller played in 10 games last year, and he played on the road. So he played at Purdue in week 1 under the lights. He played at Michigan. Even though Michigan beat Penn State pretty handily last year, he was in that environment in the Big House. So that was very smart, because now when he goes on the road for the first time as a starting quarterback, he's been on the road. He's been on the field in an opposing stadium, taking snaps and running plays. So that the way they utilized him last year and worked him into games and got him reps was really, really smart.
Yeah, they're doing the same with Bo Pribula so far through 2 games as well, which has been great to see. Other games, Northwestern goes on the road and takes on a very good Duke team that we've seen already come out of the gates hot. Indiana plays host to Louisville, and plenty more, which includes our 2 on NBC. First one on Peacock at 5 p.m. Eastern time. Number 8 Washington goes to East Lansing and takes on a Michigan State team. They don't have a lot going on right now or anything. There's not a whole lot going on in East Lansing. No, Mel Tucker is suspended indefinitely, the head coach of the Spartans, with an internal investigation. Not too much to report on it other than that. It's an internal investigation that's going to keep him sidelined until there's any sort of further news or information to go with. So they're going to be without their head coach. Michigan State is going to be a heavy underdog in this game. Washington comes in with Michael Penix, one of the best quarterbacks in the country. They're a top 10 team at number 8 in the country. And Penix, 859 yards, 8 touchdowns through his first 2 games. You mentioned a former Big Ten transfer himself. And Washington, with Kalen DeBoer as the head coach, with Penix as the quarterback, has looked as strong as they were expected to coming into the season. Michigan State, Noah Kim, their quarterback, has taken over for Peyton Thorne. He completed 18 of 22 passes last week for nearly 300 yards and 3 touchdowns against Richmond. He was the Big Ten player of the offensive player of the week in the Big Ten. So he's played pretty solid so far, assuming that starting role. But this is a different challenge altogether, going up against a top 10 team. And without your head coach, certainly it's going to be an adventure. Let's call it.
Yeah. Well, a couple things here. First of all, where Michigan State has really struggled, even a couple years ago when they had the 10 or 11 wins, is defensively and just their ability to stop people. And now, so far this year, they've held their first 2 opponents to just a little bit over 200 yards a game of offense, but they've not played a Power 5 opponent yet. Not only is this their first Power 5 in Washington, but one of the best offenses in all of college football, so they'll have their hands full, and they're going to have to play really well on defense, because I don't think they're a team that's going to be built to make big comebacks. They've got to keep the game close with Washington at home. Their defense is really going to have to step up, maybe win the turnovers, maybe try to win the special teams in some way. But if they fall behind Washington and give up explosive plays, I don't know that their offense right now is built to play catch up. So we'll see. But it helps playing at home, that's for sure. And then we'll just see, the other team in the state, Michigan, has done okay without their head coach. They've kind of shuffled their staff around. I think Harlan Barnett is going to be the acting head coach. And I think Mark D'Antonio is actually coming back to, lend assistance. And I'm not sure what that role is going to be or look like. But we'll see how they handle, the situation without their head coach as well.
So that game is 5 p.m. Eastern time. That is on Peacock. Number 8, Washington at Michigan State. A lot of excitement surrounding that one, certainly for the Huskies, and we'll see if the Spartans can find a way to shock the entire country. Our game is 7:30 p.m. as always on NBC. Our pregame coverage starts at 7 o'clock. Syracuse goes to West Lafayette, takes on Purdue. It is the same exact situation as when these two teams faced off last year. Syracuse is 2-0, Purdue is 1-1. That one was at the JMA Wireless Dome, and it ended up being, and I just rewatched it, one of the most exciting games in all of college football last year. It looked like one of the most boring games through the first couple of quarters. It was a rock fight, essentially, through 3 quarters. And then the fourth quarter, it wasn't just that there was a lot of scoring. It was that there were maybe more penalties than I've ever seen in a game down the stretch in the fourth quarter of that one. And Dino Babers, the head coach at Syracuse, yesterday in his weekly press conference, someone said, "Hey, what do you remember about that game last year? And what do you take away?" He goes, "I remember a lot of penalties." Because that's what it was. It was flag after flag after flag that allowed Syracuse to eventually win the game. It was a touchdown with 7 seconds left from Garrett Schrader to Aronde Gatson. And the bummer for us is that Aronde Gatson, who was the number 1 receiver for Syracuse, is all than likely not going to play this week after injuring what appeared to be his ankle last week in the victory over Western Michigan. A victory that was another lopsided win for Syracuse, 113-7. Is what they've outscored their first 2 opponents, Colgate and Western Michigan. But first Power 5 opponent for them. For Purdue, they come off a massive win against Virginia Tech, as we had chronicled. And similarly to last year, it feels like they're starting to put it together after starting 1-1. Now a different circumstance, because you mentioned that first loss last year was to Penn State. First loss this year was to Fresno State. But a lot of storylines in this game for sure. Another one that could be exciting for us to call. What stands out to you as we get set to head over there to Indiana?
Well, I think one thing that stands out to me is 2 really good quarterbacks. I mean, Hudson Card's his first year at Purdue, transferred from Texas. We talked about earlier. I mean, when he filled in for the injured Quinn Ewers last year, he played well at times at Texas. So, he came to Purdue this year with Graham Harrell, the new offensive coordinator, who came from West Virginia. They're expecting big things from that combination, and I think we'll see it. I think he's very talented. And then Garrett Schrader, he's another guy who transferred, not last year, but the year before, from Mississippi State. So he came from a different offensive system. He's kind of a bigger, somewhat of a dual threat guy. I mean, he's not afraid to run the football. He's a tough guy, but he's been throwing the ball really well here the first couple games. So I think it's a good matchup of 2 quarterbacks. We have 2 African-American head coaches in the game with Ryan Walters and Dino Babers. So that's always kind of cool when that happens, when you have that opportunity. And then I think for Purdue, just a chance to play a quality opponent and see if they can get a win. So good matchup. I think it's going to be a fun game to call. And again, they announced that it was a sellout a couple of weeks ago. So I think the atmosphere for our primetime game on 7:30 on Saturday night will be a lot of fun.
You mentioned it on NBC, 7:30. Hopefully that sellout crowd comes to deliver. I feel pretty confident they will. They know it's a big game. They know what happened at the Dome last year. And watching that game back from last year between these 2 teams, similar week 3 in Syracuse, the crowd was legit in that one and really did end up making a difference for the Orange. And so hopefully Purdue and their faithful see that and say, okay, let's see if we can get our get back a little bit. But a fascinating matchup that has implications kind of moving forward just in the trajectory of both seasons. Because Purdue, despite starting 1-2 last year, we know how they finished the season, found themselves in the Big Ten championship game. So it certainly helps that this is out of conference. It certainly helped that their first game that was a loss was also out of conference. And so it allows them to play three really good non-conference opponents to start the season, two out of the ACC, but three really good tests for themselves before they get started in their Big Ten slate this year.
Yeah, I remember when I was visiting Purdue this spring. I wanted to go out and visit all of the new head coaches in the Big Ten West, and when I went to Purdue, and I remember, all the teams in the locker room, they had their schedules up, like in big letters or helmets or whatever on the wall. And when I looked at their schedule, I'm like, wow, that is not an easy schedule for a first-year coach and for a first-time head coach like Ryan Walters. I mean, because Fresno State is a good football program, and a good coach in Jeff Tedford. And then you go to Virginia Tech, even though they haven't, like we said, has not been the same as they were several years ago. Blacksburg's a tough place to go win, and then you come back and play Syracuse. So a really difficult way to start your first year as a head coach. Before you even get into the Big Ten schedule. So, but they're sitting at 1-1, and I think if you'd have told Ryan Walters, you got a chance to be 1-1 going into this Syracuse game, he'd have been pretty thankful for that right now.
No doubt. So again, 7:30 NBC. We'll have all the coverage starting at 7, and the other game on Peacock, Washington and Michigan State, is 5 p.m. Eastern. Let's go to our Xfinity 10G network. Big connections on and off the field. We're going to go to Michigan for this one, and the Wolverines starting strong as expected, despite Jim Harbaugh being sidelined for the first 3 games. They are 2-0, and Roman Wilson has now caught 5 touchdowns through 2 games from J.J. McCarthy. You could feel the connection. Literally, you can feel the connection. He had a hat trick week 1. He had 2 more week 2, and it feels like that's going to be the duo that is going to really push this Michigan offense over the top.
Yeah, my question going into this season, I love Michigan. I loved everything about their team, their chemistry, their culture. I wondered if they had elite level players at the wide receiver position. I mean, I like Roman Wilson. I thought he was really good, in certain situations receiver, but he's looking like a number 1 guy, and so he's really stepping up his game. I think J.J. McCarthy is playing at a very, very high level, very confident level, throwing the football right now. And actually their passing game is a little bit ahead of their run game, which the Michigan run game is going to ultimately flex its muscles. So to see Roman Wilson step up as a number 1 guy is great news if you're a Michigan fan.
And Jim Harbaugh will miss just 1 more game, but have you been impressed with what you've seen out of Michigan considering the absence? I know that maybe the level of opponent isn't necessarily what they're eventually going to see when he comes back, but even so, the way that they've just looked clean so far.
Yeah, I mean, they have. They've looked dominant the way you expect them to look on both sides of the ball, and I just think that they have enough maturity and enough of a culture in place that they're just taking care of business, and they'll be happy when they get their head coach back. But until he does, they're going about their business.
Yeah, we'll see what Michigan can do moving forward. That first Big Ten game, week 4 against Rutgers, will be the return of Jim Harbaugh. Let's just go into our food action for the week. I know that this was the one thing we're realizing is we're busy with these schedules. The Big Ten Saturday night keeps us busy all the way up until kickoff and even after the fact. So very limited time to make sure that we're getting high-level cuisine at each place. But I know that you're still going to find a way each week, even if it's not at the site of the game.
Right.
So tell me what the best thing you ate was this week.
Yeah, the best thing I had this week was when I got home on Sunday. My wife, who I've said is a Cajun, made authentic red beans and rice. And I don't know if you've ever had the real kind of red beans and rice, but this was, the beans soak and cook and ham stock and just unbelievable. So, and the good news is she made a big enough pot that I'm eating it again today. So I get to have more of it before I go on the road. So I had it when I first got home, and I get a little bit more before I go on the road this week.
Yeah, that looks legit. That looks
it
legit.
Is. Yeah. All you need is just some like crusty French bread, to go with it, and then you're dialed in.
Here's the problem is we record this too early in the day because then I just go, I'm going to try a bunch of different stuff. Todd did say this, so I guess I might as well give it a try. And then I eat way more calories than I should.
Yeah.
So again, I know you said it our first episode, the gym's going to be necessary for me as I continue to embark on these journeys with you. I mentioned it, and next time you're in College Park, I know you're going to go right around the corner in that Silver Springs area in Maryland. Mi Rancho. I was myself, Tyler Freed, my spotter, and Josh Selesnik, my statistician, all went there. We each got quesadillas. It was a great night before the game meal, and we went to Ben & Jerry's after. So you can never go wrong.
Can't beat that.
You can never go wrong with some Chunky Monkey. That's what I went with.
Love Chunky Monkey. Yeah.
Yeah, high level stuff. All right, Todd, that's 3 episodes down. Feeling good. We've got momentum now this season, and we appreciate you all joining us. Hopefully you'll do the same next week. We will be back with more big talk. Thanks for tuning in this week. Todd, Noah, signing off. We're presented by Xfinity 10G Network, and make sure to download and subscribe on the NBC Sports YouTube channel and wherever you get your audio podcast. We'll talk to you this week from West Lafayette and talk to you again next week, same time, same place, same everything.